If we want to understand the magnitude of the crisis India faces today, with tariffs pressing down on its exports, we must first remind ourselves of the story that brought us here. India's relationship with trade is not a recent development born of globalization, it is woven into the very fabric of its history. For centuries, this land has been defined by its exports. From the silks and spices that drew ancient merchants across seas to the cotton that clothed entire continents, India was not just a participant in global trade, it was a force that shaped it. Exports were more than transactions, they were a channel of cultural exchange, of influence, and of national identity. They carried with them the weight of a civilization's creativity and productivity. This historical backdrop is essential because it places today's challenges in sharper relief. When tariffs disrupt India's exports, it is not merely an economic inconvenience. It feels like a fracture in a long-standing legacy of contribution to the world. Consider how, in the modern era, India transformed from being primarily an exporter of raw materials under colonial exploitation into a nation that carved out niches in textiles, pharmaceuticals, jewelry, agriculture, and eventually IT services. Each of these transitions was more than a shift in product lines, it was an assertion of independence and a declaration of resilience. The export economy was proof that India could stand on its own feet, innovate, and compete with the best on the global stage. But now, as tariffs rise and markets tighten, there is a psychological toll. The pride that once accompanied India's ability to deliver goods and services across continents begins to erode under the weight of barriers it cannot control. Exporters are forced to grapple with a dissonance. They know they have the skill, the quality, the innovation, but they are confronted by artificial obstacles erected in the name of protectionism. This creates frustration, even a quiet sense of disempowerment, because the very thing that defined India's historic and modern strength, its capacity to trade and exchange, is being constrained by forces outside its borders. The challenge before us, then, is not just economic, it is existential. If trade has always been a mirror of India's dynamism, then to see it hampered by tariffs is to question whether the nation can continue to project itself outward as confidently as it once did. This is why the conversation about tariffs cannot remain in the realm of numbers and percentages alone. It touches something deeper, a story of identity, of continuity, and of purpose. And so, when we speak of India's exports reeling from tariffs, we are not simply speaking of balance sheets or GDP figures, we are speaking of a disruption to a legacy centuries in the making. The question we must ask ourselves is this: will we allow that legacy to be defined by external barriers, or will we find within ourselves the creativity and courage to keep the story of Indian trade alive in spite of them? The answer to that question will determine not just the future of our economy, but the very narrative of who we are as a nation. When we step back and examine the bigger picture, it becomes clear that the pressures India is facing are not isolated or accidental. They are part of a much larger pattern unfolding across the world. A ripple effect created by escalating tariff wars and protectionist impulses that seem to be sweeping through the global economy. What we are witnessing is not just a dispute between two countries, nor is it limited to one set of industries. It is the symptom of a deeper shift in how nations are approaching trade, power, and their own vulnerabilities. Over the past decade, the language of cooperation that once defined globalization has been increasingly replaced by the language of suspicion and defense. Countries that once championed free trade are now quick to erect barriers when it suits their domestic interests. The United States, for instance, has often framed tariffs as tools of national security, while China has responded with equal force, creating a cycle of retaliation. The problem is that when giants clash, the shockwaves are felt most strongly by economies like India's, which depend heavily on export-driven growth. The ripple effect is both economic and psychological. Economically, it manifests as higher costs, disrupted supply chains, and shrinking access to markets. Psychologically, it creates a climate of uncertainty where exporters and investors no longer know what rules will govern tomorrow's trade. And uncertainty is, in many ways, more damaging than the tariffs themselves. An exporter can adapt to higher costs if they are stable and predictable. But how does one build long-term strategies when the rules of the game change with every political cycle, or even with a single tweet from a powerful leader? This instability undermines confidence, not only in markets but in the very idea of globalization itself. What was once hailed as a pathway to shared prosperity now feels fragile, even volatile. For India, this is particularly dangerous because its growth trajectory has been built on the assumption of open markets and steadily expanding trade opportunities. When those assumptions collapse, the nation is left to ask whether its ambitions have been built on quicksand. There is also a deeper philosophical point here. Tariffs are rarely just about economics. They are about power, control, and signaling dominance. They are the blunt instruments of geopolitics, often aimed at securing leverage in negotiations that extend far beyond the realm of trade. In this sense, India finds itself caught in a storm not of its own making, yet one that threatens to destabilize its progress. The global order is shifting from collaboration toward confrontation, and every exporting nation is forced to adjust to this new reality. The truth is, the ripple effect of these tariff wars reminds us that no nation stands alone in the modern economy. Isolation is an illusion, and interdependence is inescapable. The real question is whether India will continue to be a passive recipient of these waves, or whether it will learn to ride them, shaping its strategies with foresight rather than fear. Because if India cannot master the ripples, then the ripples will master India. When we talk about tariffs, it is tempting to reduce them to mere numbers. Percentages imposed on goods, costs added to transactions, figures that can be measured in spreadsheets. But in reality, tariffs operate on a deeper level. They are not only instruments of economics, they are instruments of psychology. They are designed to send signals, to provoke reactions, to shift the balance of negotiation by introducing uncertainty and pressure. In other words, tariffs are less about the actual math of trade and more about the message they carry. Think of how a tariff functions in practice. When one nation suddenly raises tariffs on another, the immediate financial effect is visible: higher prices, reduced competitiveness, disrupted supply chains. But beneath that surface lies something more profound: the creation of doubt. Exporters who were once confident about their access to a market suddenly question whether that door will remain open tomorrow. Investors hesitate, fearing instability. Consumers lose trust in the reliability of supply. In this way, tariffs work not only by changing the rules of exchange, but by altering the state of mind of those who participate in it. This is why tariffs are often deployed as bargaining chips in the theater of geopolitics. They are less about protecting domestic industries and more about testing the resilience and patience of trading partners. They force the weaker side into a corner, not simply by reducing profit margins, but by eroding the sense of stability upon which long-term planning depends. For India, this is particularly significant because its exporters, many of them small and medium enterprises, thrive on consistency. Remove that consistency, and you do more than harm their businesses. You weaken their confidence, their willingness to innovate, even their faith in the fairness of the global order. There is also an ethical dimension here that is worth considering. To manipulate another nation's economy through tariffs is, in many ways, to manipulate its psychology. It is to say, why hold the power to make your future uncertain? That kind of pressure does not only alter balance sheets, it shapes national identities, forcing countries to internalize vulnerability. Over time, this can breed resentment, nationalism, and mistrust, which in turn erode the very foundations of cooperation that global trade was meant to build. So the question is not simply how much tariffs cost in rupees or dollars. The real question is, what kind of mindset do they create in the nations subjected to them? Do they foster fear and dependency, or do they awaken resilience and self-reliance? For India, this is a moment of decision. It can choose to see tariffs as shackles that limit its opportunities, or as provocations that push it to rethink, restructure, and rise stronger. Because ultimately, tariffs are a psychological test. They are designed to measure how much uncertainty a nation can endure before it bends. And if India can hold steady, not just economically but psychologically, it will prove something far greater than its ability to trade. It will prove its ability to endure. When we think about India's exports, it is easy to picture the large corporations, the multinational giants, and the billion-dollar deals that make the headlines. But the truth is that the backbone of India's export economy is not the big conglomerates. It is the countless small and medium enterprises that line the country's towns, villages, and industrial clusters. From handloom weavers in Varanasi to spice traders in Kerala, from handicraft makers in Rajasthan to textile units in Tirupur, these enterprises are not just producing goods. They are sustaining livelihoods, preserving traditions, and carrying forward India's identity in the global marketplace. Yet it is precisely these small and medium businesses that bear the harshest brunt of tariffs. Large corporations have reserves, networks, and legal teams to maneuver through sudden disruptions. They can diversify markets, absorb costs, or shift production strategies. SMEs, however, operate on thinner margins and with limited reach. When a tariff is imposed, it is not just a matter of adjusting a balance sheet. It can mean the collapse of an entire business, the loss of jobs, and the unraveling of families who depend on that income. A few percentage points added to the cost of export may look like statistics on paper, but on the ground, it can spell ruin for small traders who already operate on the edge of survival. And the damage is not only economic, it is also psychological. Imagine the craftsman who pours his skill and identity into a product only to find that his goods are priced out of the foreign market because of a tariff over which he has no control. Imagine the small exporter who finally secures a global buyer after years of effort, only to lose that relationship overnight because tariffs suddenly make the deal unviable. What begins as an external policy decision far away in another country ripples inward, shaking the confidence and dignity of individuals who had once believed that their work could carry them into prosperity. This is where we begin to see the invisible cost of tariffs. It is not just the lost revenue, it is the erosion of hope. When SMEs feel abandoned in the face of global disruptions, when they sense that they are pawns in a larger geopolitical chess game, it weakens the very spirit that drives entrepreneurship. And when that spirit fades, it is not just one business or one community that suffers, it is the collective vitality of a nation's economy that begins to dim. India cannot afford to let this backbone collapse. For without these enterprises, exports are not just weakened, they are hollowed out. The true measure of resilience lies not in how the biggest players withstand pressure, but in how the smallest survive. And so the question we must carry forward is this: if tariffs test the strength of our economy, will we allow our smallest exporters to be the ones who break first, or will we rise to protect them? Because in protecting them, we protect the very foundation of India's place in the world. There is an uncomfortable, but necessary question we must ask ourselves at this point. Has India leaned too heavily on the outside world to fuel its growth? For decades, the dominant narrative has been that exports are the engine of prosperity, that integration with global markets is the surest path to development, and in many ways that has proven true. Trade has lifted millions out of poverty, created opportunities across industries, and placed India firmly on the global map. But every dependency carries within it a vulnerability, and it is only when the external world begins to shift through tariffs, sanctions, or trade wars that we are forced to confront how exposed we truly are. The dependence on external markets has shaped not only our economy, but our psychology. It has cultivated an expectation that growth will always come from outside, that there will always be buyers abroad eager for Indian textiles, pharmaceuticals, software, or agricultural goods. This mindset has made us chase foreign demand as though it were an inexhaustible well, while sometimes overlooking the potential of our own domestic market and the resilience it could provide. The danger of this psychological pattern is that when external doors close, we feel paralyzed, unable to imagine an alternative path. This is not merely an economic predicament, it is a philosophical one. Do we define progress solely by how well we sell to the world, or can we begin to see progress as the cultivation of strength within? Dependence on external markets is a double-edged sword. On one side, it offers access, opportunity, and growth. On the other, it creates a fragile reliance that can be shaken by decisions made in distant capitals, by leaders with agendas that have nothing to do with our welfare. None of this means that India should retreat into isolation. That is neither possible nor desirable in a world that is deeply interconnected. But it does mean that India must ask what balance looks like. What does it mean to integrate with the world without being at the mercy of its every fluctuation? What does it mean to develop an export strategy that is robust not only when the global climate is favorable, but also when storms of protectionism rage? Perhaps the answer lies in reimagining self-reliance not as withdrawal, but as diversification and balance. It lies in strengthening regional trade, in nurturing domestic demand, in encouraging innovation that is not only aimed at satisfying foreign consumers, but also at enriching the lives of Indian citizens. If dependence has been the story of the past, resilience must be the story of the future, and so we arrive at a truth that cannot be ignored. An economy defined solely by external approval is an economy always at risk of collapse. The challenge before India is to build a model of growth where the outside world is a partner, not a master. Because the moment we stop confusing access with security, we begin to write a story not of dependence, but of genuine strength. If tariffs expose vulnerabilities, they also present an invitation to rethink, to reinvent, and to rise stronger than before. History has shown us that adversity, though painful, often becomes the crucible in which resilience is forged. For India, this moment of global protectionism is not only a test, but also an opportunity to reimagine its place in the world economy, not as a nation that merely reacts to external pressures, but as one that sets its own direction with clarity and conviction. Resilience begins with diversification. For far too long, India's export story has leaned heavily on a handful of sectors and markets, leaving it vulnerable when those channels narrow. But the world is vast, and so are the possibilities. Exploring new regions, deepening partnerships within Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and building stronger South-South cooperation could reduce overdependence on Western markets. Each new partnership is more than a commercial exchange, it is a step toward balance, a widening of the foundation upon which growth can stand. But reinvention goes beyond geography. It also demands innovation in what we produce and how we produce it. Tariffs remind us that price competition alone is not sustainable. If Indian exports are to thrive in the long run, they must be known not only for affordability but also for uniqueness, creativity, and quality that cannot be easily substituted. That requires investment in research, in technology, and in the skills of our people. It requires shifting from a mindset of survival to one of leadership. And perhaps most importantly, resilience requires strengthening the domestic ecosystem. A strong home market is not a retreat from globalization. It is the firm ground from which a nation can engage with the world. When Indian enterprises can thrive at home, they gain the strength to withstand the storms abroad. When consumers within the country value and support local innovation, it creates a culture of confidence that extends outward. Self-reliance, in this sense, is not about building walls, it is about building roots deep enough to hold firm when winds blow hard. The philosophical challenge before us is this: will we let adversity shrink us, or will we allow it to expand us? Tariffs are temporary, they rise and fall with politics. But the choices we make in response, whether to merely absorb the blow or to transform the structure of our economy, those choices have lasting consequences. A resilient India does not wait for the world to ease its barriers, it learns to grow in spite of them. And that is the essence of the path forward, to see in every challenge not just a limit, but a summons to create something greater. Because in the end, the story of India's exports should not be about how the world restricted us, but about how we refuse to be restricted.